Rachael Anderson was 24 years old when her life was taken on a day meant to celebrate it. Friends and family would later say that birthdays had always mattered to her, not for attention, but for togetherness. She valued moments, conversations, and plans for the future. On January 28, 2018, those plans were cut short inside her own apartment in Columbus, Ohio, a place she believed was safe. Rachael was an aspiring funeral director, a career choice that reflected her compassion and sense of responsibility. She wanted to help families during their most difficult moments, offering dignity and care when words often fail. Those who knew her described her as thoughtful, driven, and kind, someone who took her goals seriously and treated others with respect. Her future appeared stable, structured, and full of possibility. The day of her birthday began quietly. There were no public celebrations, no dramatic events that suggested danger was approaching. Rachael spent time at home, surrounded by familiarity. Nothing about the hours leading up to the crime indicated that her life was about to intersect with someone who posed a serious threat. At some point that day, Anthony Pardon entered her apartment. Pardon was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. He was a registered sex offender with an extensive criminal history, a fact that would later raise troubling questions about public safety and accountability. His presence in Rachael's life was not part of her long-term plans, nor was it something her loved ones anticipated. What followed was an act of violence that shattered multiple lives. Rachael was attacked inside her own home, a violation that stripped away the sense of security most people associate with private spaces. The crime did not happen in a dark alley or an unfamiliar environment. It happened where she lived, where she rested, and where she should have been safest. After the attack, Pardon left Rachael's body concealed in her bedroom closet. The deliberate act of hiding her there spoke to an awareness of wrongdoing and an attempt to delay discovery. He then left the apartment, walking away from a scene that would soon become the center of a major criminal investigation. The next day, concern grew when Rachael failed to respond to messages. Loved ones noticed something was wrong. When her body was discovered, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. What should have been a moment of birthday celebration turned into a devastating confirmation of loss. News of Rachael's death spread quickly. The community struggled to understand how such violence could occur to someone so young, so focused on helping others. The fact that it happened on her birthday only deepened the sense of cruelty surrounding the crime. For her family, grief was accompanied by disbelief. The reality felt unreal, impossible to accept. Law enforcement moved swiftly. The scene inside the apartment provided crucial evidence. Investigators began piecing together timelines, movements, and digital data. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from cell phone records, which placed Anthony Pardon at the location during the critical time frame. DNA evidence further strengthened the case, creating a clear link between Pardon and the crime. As details emerged, public anger grew. Many questioned how someone with Pardon's criminal background had the freedom to commit another violent offense. Discussions about system failures, monitoring of offenders, and community safety intensified. Rachael's death became part of a larger conversation about accountability and prevention. Within a short period, Anthony Pardon was arrested and formally charged with Rachael Anderson's murder. The evidence against him was substantial, and like many cases that rely heavily on circumstantial details, this investigation produced concrete proof that would later become central in court. For Rachael's family, the arrest brought a mix of emotions. There was relief that a suspect had been identified, but no sense of closure. No legal action could restore what had been taken. Their focus shifted from searching for answers to preparing for a long legal process, one that would force them to relive the loss repeatedly. Rachael's story, once private and personal, was now public. Media coverage highlighted her aspiration, her kindness, and the devastating way her life ended. She became more than a victim's name. She became a reminder of how quickly violence can intrude into ordinary lives. This was only the beginning of a case that would unfold over years. The investigation had established what happened and who was responsible, but justice was still ahead. Courtrooms, testimonies, and painful evidence would soon follow. As the investigation into Rachael Anderson's murder moved forward, the focus shifted from shock to accountability. Law enforcement now had a responsibility not only to prove what had happened, but to ensure that the case was strong enough to withstand scrutiny in court. This phase of the process was methodical, intense, and emotionally draining for everyone involved, especially Rachael's family. Detectives began by reconstructing Rachael's final hours in detail. They analyzed her movements, communications, and interactions on the day of January 28, 2018. Phone records became a central piece of evidence. Investigators examined call logs, text messages, and location data to establish a clear timeline. This digital trail confirmed that Anthony Pardon had been in contact with Rachael and placed him at her apartment during the critical time frame. The use of cell phone data was particularly important. In modern investigations, digital evidence often speaks louder than eyewitness accounts. Location pings, timestamps, and usage patterns provided objective confirmation that could not easily be disputed. In this case, the data aligned consistently with other findings, reinforcing the narrative investigators were building. Physical evidence collected from the apartment further strengthened the case. DNA evidence directly linked Pardon to the crime scene, removing ambiguity about his involvement. For prosecutors, this combination of digital and physical proof formed a foundation that would later prove decisive. The case did not rely on speculation, it was supported by tangible, traceable facts. As the evidence mounted, authorities reviewed Anthony Pardon's background more closely. His criminal history revealed a pattern of behavior that raised serious concerns. He was a registered sex offender with prior convictions, information that became central to public discussion surrounding the case. Many questioned how someone with such a record was able to move freely within the community. These revelations intensified public reaction. Rachel's death was no longer seen solely as an isolated tragedy, it became a symbol of broader systemic failures. Community members, advocates, and commentators began calling for stricter monitoring of offenders and better protections for vulnerable individuals. The case sparked conversations that extended far beyond the courtroom. For Rachel's family, this stage of the investigation was agonizing. Each new detail confirmed the reality of their loss while exposing aspects of the crime they wished they never had to know. They were asked to cooperate with investigators, review evidence, and prepare for legal proceedings that would stretch on for years. Grief became intertwined with endurance. As charges were formally filed, the legal process began to take shape. Anthony Pardon was charged with Rachael Anderson's murder, a step that signaled the seriousness of the case. Prosecutors prepared to argue not only that he committed the crime, but that the evidence left no room for doubt. Defense strategies were anticipated, and every piece of evidence was evaluated for strength and relevance. Court proceedings moved slowly, as they often do in major criminal cases. Delays, hearings, and procedural steps tested the patience of everyone involved. For the family, each court appearance reopened emotional wounds. Justice, while necessary, came at a psychological cost. Throughout this time, Rachel's life remained at the center of the narrative. Prosecutors emphasized who she was, not just how she died. They spoke of her career aspiration, her compassion, and the future she was working toward. This approach was intentional. It ensured that the case did not reduce her to a statistic, but honored her humanity. Media coverage continued, but with increased focus on accountability. Reports highlighted the strength of the evidence and the seriousness of the charges. While public attention can sometimes fade, Rachel's case maintained visibility, in part because of the clarity of the investigation and the broader issues it raised. As the trial approached, the weight of what was coming became undeniable. For investigators, it was the moment when years of work would be tested. For prosecutors, it was the responsibility of presenting the truth with precision and respect. And for Rachel's family, it was the painful realization that closure, if it came at all, would only come after confronting the details in open court. The case was no longer about finding answers. Those had largely been established. Now it was about ensuring consequences. Justice, in its legal form, requires process, patience, and proof. Rachael Anderson's case had all three, but the emotional cost of pursuing them was immense. As the courtroom phase drew closer, one truth remained constant: nothing could undo the harm done. Yet accountability mattered not just for Rachael, but for the principle that violence must be met with responsibility. The next stage would determine how her story would be formally concluded in the eyes of the law. That conclusion, however, would not bring peace easily. It would bring finality, acknowledgement, and a record that ensured her name would not be forgotten. The final chapter of this story would unfold where facts meet judgment, and where justice, in its most permanent form, would be decided.
The final phase of Rachael Anderson's case unfolded in a courtroom where facts, evidence, and testimony converged to determine accountability. By the time the trial process advanced, the foundation of the case was already strong. Investigators had established a clear timeline, prosecutors had assembled extensive proof, and the defense faced evidence that was difficult to challenge. Yet, despite the legal clarity, the emotional weight of the proceedings remained immense. Courtroom proceedings are often described as clinical, but in cases like this, emotion is unavoidable. Every mention of Rachel's name carried meaning. She was no longer present to speak for herself, so her story had to be told through records, testimony, and the voices of those who loved her. Prosecutors presented the narrative carefully, ensuring that the jury understood not only what happened, but who Rachael was as a person. Evidence was presented methodically, Cell phone data confirmed Anthony Pardon's movements and communications, placing him in Rachel's apartment at the time of the crime. DNA evidence reinforced this conclusion, eliminating uncertainty about his involvement. Together, these elements formed a cohesive and compelling account that left little room for alternative explanations. The defense had limited options. When evidence is both digital and physical, it becomes difficult to undermine its credibility. Attempts to question timelines or interpretations could not erase the consistency between independent sources of proof. Each piece of evidence supported the others, creating a chain that was difficult to break. Throughout the trial, Rachel's family sat through proceedings that forced them to relive their loss. This experience is one of the hardest aspects of seeking justice. Families must listen as intimate details are discussed publicly, knowing that this process is necessary but deeply painful. Their presence in the courtroom reflected strength, even as they carried grief that would never fully fade. Witness testimony further reinforced the prosecution's case. Investigators explained how the evidence was collected and analyzed. Experts clarified technical data in ways jurors could understand. Each testimony added another layer of certainty, ensuring that the case was not based on assumption but on verifiable facts. As the trial progressed, the focus shifted toward responsibility and consequence. The question was no longer whether Anthony Pardon committed the crime, but how the justice system should respond. Given his criminal history and the severity of the offense, the stakes were high. Prosecutors argued for the maximum sentence, emphasizing both the harm done to Rachael and the risk posed to society.
In 2020, the verdict was delivered. Anthony Pardon was convicted of the murder of Rachael Anderson. The decision affirmed what investigators had worked to establish since the beginning, that Rachel's death was the result of deliberate and criminal actions, and that those actions would not go unanswered. Sentencing followed, and with it came a sense of finality. Pardon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This outcome ensured that he would never again pose a threat to the community. While no sentence can undo the harm caused, the ruling represented the strongest form of accountability available under the law. For Rachel's family, the sentence brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief that justice had been served, but also the recognition that life would never return to what it once was. Court rulings can close cases, but they do not close wounds. Grief does not disappear when a verdict is read; it evolves, becoming part of daily life. Public reaction to the sentencing reflected broader concerns about safety and prevention. Many questioned how someone with Pardon's background had the opportunity to commit such a crime. Rachel's case became part of ongoing discussions about offender monitoring, public awareness, and systemic responsibility. In this way, her story extended beyond personal tragedy and into societal reflection. Rachael Anderson's legacy is not defined by how she died, but by who she was, and the conversations her story continues to inspire. She was a young woman with ambition, empathy, and plans for a future centered on helping others. Those qualities remain central to how she is remembered. Her case also serves as a reminder that violence often occurs in ordinary settings, affecting people who never imagine themselves at risk. It underscores the importance of awareness, communication, and accountability not only within the justice system, but within communities as a whole. Today, Rachel's name stands as a call for remembrance and responsibility. Her story has been documented, her case resolved, and her life honored through truth and justice. While nothing can restore what was lost, accountability ensures that her story is not forgotten or dismissed. Justice, in this case, was firm and final, but remembrance is ongoing. Through telling her story, through acknowledging the lessons it carries, Rachael Anderson's voice continues to be heard quietly, persistently, and with purpose.